Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here in the John Hope Franklin Center, and we're joined today by Professor Riché Barnes, who is the Dean of Pierson College at Yale University, where she also holds an appointment in the Department of Anthropology. She's the author of Raising the Race, Black Career Women Redefine Marriage, Motherhood, and Community, Rutgers University Press, and the winner of the 2017 Race, Gender, and Class Selection Book Award from the American Sociological Association. How are you doing today, Professor Barnes?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. You're visiting Duke as part of the race workshop
Yes.
that we do here. Talk a little bit about that experience and what your interactions have been with folks here at Duke so far.
So far, it's been amazing. I've met with graduate students whose work is really fascinating, and we have quite a few overlaps in some of the research areas, particularly with Leslie Ford. She's looking at African American women and some of the decisions they're making in terms of partnering and relationships. I haven't given my talk yet, so not a lot of interaction with the department yet, but good friend Lee Baker in the Anthropology department and I had a chance to catch up a few minutes ago. So.
You say very early in your book that the book is an intervention.
Yes.
And there's a way in which I think we, generally thinking, some of our colleagues in the academy, rarely think about black women's lives as a site of knowledge production.
Yes.
And not only are you making that particular claim, you're making the claim about the lives of black middle class women
Yes.
and mothers.
Yes.
Talk about your journey to their stories.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a really cool story. I was working on my dissertation and thinking through, actually starting on a different project. I was actually interested in looking at gentrification. I was doing research in Atlanta. I was at Emory University. A lot of things had been changing in Atlanta at the time.
Yeah.
And I was really interested in questions about how people moving back into the city can be a site of sustainable development.
Right.
And that was going pretty well, but I wasn't entirely excited about it. And at the same time, I was just starting my own family. And I'd recently gotten married, I had my first child, and I was taking her to story time at the local library. And I was running into these women. If you know anything about Atlanta, you know there are pockets of African American neighborhoods,
Right.
large neighborhoods with a lot of amenities and primarily for African Americans, right? So we were at story time, and there I was meeting all these African American women who were at story time in the middle of the day. And they looked a lot like me, right? And this kind of professional vibe, right? And I was really intrigued, having conversations with them. You know, we were going kind of once a week or twice a week and interacting with them and finding out that they had been in professional life, right? They had had careers and they were home. They were with their kids and taking a break, but not necessarily on maternity leave. So I got really interested in this because I was curious, right? This wasn't a model I was familiar with in the African American community. I knew about white professional women taking a break from work, but I didn't know any black women who had taken a break from work. And so I went back to my committee and I was kind of like, so I'm thinking about this other question that's really intriguing to me. And at the same time, the conversation about lean in and opt out and why professional white women were leaving the workplace in large numbers was hitting the kind of the mainstream media. Right. There was a conversation in New York Times, there was a conversation in Time. People were trying to understand what had happened to the feminist movement, why all these women who had, you know, broken through so many ceilings were deciding to
Right.
go home. So when I pitched it to my committee, I pitched it from that lens. We don't have this conversation around black women and how black women make decisions about work and family. And so that's kind of how it started. I did a preliminary study with the women that I had met at Storytime and a few other women to see if it was actually feasible. Mm-hmm. And then I opened it up to working with other women, finding women through lots of different venues, schools, churches. I found a few stay-at-home mom support groups, and that's when it got really interesting.
What were the responses of some of your informants when they realized that you were in fact studying their lives and thinking about their lives more broadly, particularly when folks weren't necessarily asking them very specific questions about the choices or really non-choices that they made?
Yeah, absolutely. They were so thrilled to talk to me. I initially thought, how am I going to get these women to talk to me about really intimate things, right? Really intimate spaces in their lives, conversations they were having with their mothers, their husbands, their friends and family. That in a lot of ways, the things that they were encountering were counter to how they had been raised. So how was I going to get them to talk to me about this and be honest about it, right? And no, they were so forthcoming. We had hours-long conversations. I would have to go back to them over and over again to finish my series of questions. They were so excited for the work. And I say at one point in the book that there was one participant who kept insisting that she could help me finish. You know, she's like, I really want you to finish this work. It's so important. Like, can I help you? Can I type something? Can I, like, she was like, and I'm like, no, you can't. Thank you though, I really appreciate it. But yeah, and then when the book came out, some of them got a hold of it right away and contacted me, and just, one of them started crying just because she said, you got it. Like you heard me. And that, I feel like I'm about to tear up myself. Like that's why you do the work, right? Right. And you hope that work that you're doing, that connection you're making, that relationality that's being created is something that can then be used to support change, to motivate change, to open up possibilities, particularly for Black women.
And it's a narrative that we don't hear a lot publicly about Black women,
Absolutely.
Right? Because in some ways, Black women historically have not had choices, right?
Absolutely.
They don't have the choice to not be on the ground mothers. Right. They've never had the choice really to not work. Right. They've always had to work. They've always had to be mothers. You talk about the second shift.
Yes.
Right. You know, that 8 to 5 and then that 6 to whenever, when they go home and they're taking care of a husband and children.
Yes.
And you kind of gave voice to that in ways that we hadn't heard before.
Yes. And I think the other thing that comes through in this book is that third shift, right? That is responsibility for the community. And a lot of the women talked about not just the responsibility to their husbands, to their children, to their extended family, also to their communities. Right. Just this pull that they, especially as professional women, needed to be doing something that was going to be in support of. Right. And that's how I got to Raising the Race, right? That it's not just about how you raise your own family. It's about how you're making a contribution to the race.
And it's always been an expectation that Black women play a particular kind of role in socializing, not just their family, but the larger community. But you talk about these responsibilities, you know, typically when we start talking about elderly parents, very rarely is it the husband that takes on the responsibility. So you have wives who are not only taking care of the responsibility sometimes of taking care of her parents, but often are very engaged in the taking care of their husband's parents as they become elderly.
Yes, absolutely. And for some of the reason, that was one of the reasons why they made a modification with work, that they were having difficulty not necessarily being mothers, right? Black women know how to do that. They know how to work and mother, right? Was the other relational stuff, the other caregiving that was taking place, that was making it hard for them to maintain, that ambition of career that maybe they started with.
Talk about, you mentioned their mothers, and these women having to face the judgment of their mothers and their foremothers about what a good wife and what a good mother is, right? And in no part of that conversation historically, even a generation ago, was it, I'm a professional Black woman, I have these degrees, I'm gonna do this, this, and that, right? And so they're doing that knowing that they're also facing the judgment of elders about those choices. Absolutely.
This was a serious area of conflict for the women in my study, that The way they discussed it was their mothers and grandmothers in particular, aunties, right, were pushing them to do great things in the world, right? They were, they had set a path for them to go to college, for them to, to go to med school. In one instance in particular, there was a woman whose mother had her as a teenager, and the mother and grandmother were raising the child, but it was primarily the grandmother who was raising the child because the mother had her as a teenager. Right. So they wanted to make sure that she got her education off the ground. Right. She went to nursing school. Right. So her mother was taking care of the child. And she talked about, this woman that was in the study, talked about how her grandmother had made so many sacrifices for her to be able to go to college and then go on to medical school, and how the community she was from a rural community in Texas, and how the community had really pushed her to continue. So she felt a responsibility not only to her mother, her grandmother, but also the community that she grew up in. And she talked about how when she made the decision to, change her relationship with work, right, so that she was not on a full-time career track, but working with her husband in his business and raising their kids. At first, her parents liked it, her mom and her grandmother. They liked the idea because they were in Texas. Right. They were like, you stay home with the babies for a little while. Right. But then it was like, okay, you've been home too long. It's time for you to go back to work. And she said it really frustrated her, right? It was a source of tension in the family. But the thing that was really interesting about her telling that story was her understanding of it in terms of her relationship with her husband, because she had been raised in the household with her grandmother and her grandfather, but her grandmother had taken the leadership role, right? And her grandmother could not understand why she would put herself in a position to be taken care of by her husband. And so for this woman, her understanding of the situation was, I need to do this to take care of my family, which includes my husband. It's not just about me and the kids. Yeah, so that was those conflicts with moms and grandmothers. I had one mother who said her father would call her on occasion, when she had decided to pull back from work, and say, you still home with those babies? Home with the babies, right. It's like, when you going back to work? And that's a very different model than what we know white women to experience, right? That the expectations are that they will come home, and if they're not home, then that's different. Yeah, before you came to the studio and I was prepping for the interview, I was sitting at a local coffee shop, Park and Notice, and about 6 or 7 white women come in who are either pregnant or just have babies. They're sitting there having coffee and talking. And I've never seen that scene with African American women. In fact, I think it would give me like a serious reason to pause if I ever saw that. Exactly. That's what happened to me. I was like, what are you doing here? It's 11 o'clock in the morning. Why are you here? I know why I'm here. I'm a graduate student. Why are you here? You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Professor Riché Barnes, Professor of Anthropology and the Dean of the Pierson College at Yale University. She is also the author of the award-winning Raising the Race, Black Career Women Redefine Marriage, Motherhood, and Community. You talk in the book about how, and I have 2 daughters. I have a 19-year-old and a 15-year-old. They're independent in part because that's who their mother is. Yeah. And I had the sense enough to give them space to be independent. But you talk about the fact that, we raise Black girls to be independent, yes, but by the time they get married, they actually have to learn how to become wives. Oh, yeah. Yes. I actually asked the women in the study, a series of questions about how they were raised, right? And I was trying to get at this question of ambition, drive, what the expectations were at home for independence, strong Black woman, all those motifs. And they all of them talked about how they had been raised to be career women first, right? They had been raised to you know, they had been identified as young girls as smart and brilliant,
High achievers.
high achievers that could go off and, you know, blaze paths, right? And they, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but over half of them talked about how they were not raised to be wives. And I always make the point, and I do this in the book too, being raised to be a wife is not about, you know, you didn't learn how to cook and you didn't learn how to do laundry, you know, they got
Right.
that. What they mean when they say I wasn't raised to be a wife is they weren't raised in how to be in relationship with a man, right? And some of them have leanings in their adulthood that are more about their grounding in the church. So for some of them, it is about submission.
Right.
For some of them, it is about, you know, the man being the head of the household.
Right.
But for many of them, they're still using that language of not really knowing how to be a wife. And they said, I just didn't know how to talk to him, right? I didn't know how to support him, how to take care of him. There's one section in the book that I call Too Much I, Not Enough We. Because one of the women talked about that. She talked about how there was a point in her marriage when she felt she and her husband were going in different directions. And it was because she was still being that independent woman. This is how she talks about it. It's not what I'm saying. She was, you know, she was still being that independent, ambitious woman, and was kind of leaving him to, you know, kind of take care of himself.
Right.
And a lot of the women talked about that, you know, even once they made the decision to pull away from work in some way. And not all of them became stay-at-home moms. Some of them just pulled back a little. Some of them changed tracks so they could be more available. And they talked about availability a lot. But she talked about how making the decision to be at home was not just about, it wasn't just about taking care of the kids. It was about prioritizing their relationship and feeling like the prioritization of that relationship was about creating a family unit that would be healthy and sustainable. And she talked about that in relationship to kind of making this switch in her mind that even in terms of taking care of the kids, that was going to be a partnership. Like there was no sense that she was going to be doing it by herself.
Right.
But that instead of looking at it as he can take care of himself, I'm going to make sure the kids are okay. It was we're all taking care of each other.
And so let me complicate this a little bit. Because I often think about this in the context of fathers and marriages, and the way that, you know, now for a couple of generations, you know, black fatherlessness has been so shamed that there are ways in which black men actually overcompensate. This generation of black fathers really overcompensate for being in on the parenting, right? Even when they're not in the household. But that same shame isn't associated with not being a good partner or a good husband. So when I hear your narrative on the one hand, and then, you know, throw that into the mix where, you know, the men themselves don't feel any real pressure to be a good partner or a good husband, particularly if they're already being a great father.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's, so I didn't interview the men. I tried to, but I'm gonna need a male to work with me.
No, I got you.
To get the men to talk
to
the men. I interviewed one man, and he, you know, this was an interview schedule that if I ran through it, should have taken 30 minutes, 45 minutes. He did it in 20. He was answer. I'm like, can we elaborate a little bit? Can you tell me a little bit more about what you think about that? So I realized from talking with him and doing the interview schedule with him that I wasn't going to get enough from the men. So I didn't interview the men, but I think just from talking with the women that you're right, that there is a lot more emphasis on the men's part to being a good father. And I think the women are carrying most of the load for making sure that the partnership and the relationship is intact. And I think I hadn't thought about it from this perspective, but I think part of what they're talking about when they're talking about the importance of the family unit and sustaining a healthy family, that some of the pressure they feel to do that is because the men aren't, right? And I don't want to say that they aren't in the sense that they don't care about their wives and things like they do, right? They're going out on dates, they're being in a relationship, but it's not with the same amount of intentionality that I think the women are having at this point. Yeah.
You know, we've had these narratives about Black women not being marriageable.
Yeah.
And so we're going to put that aside for a moment. But for some of your informants, is marriage worth it for them at this point in time? You know, is there a cost associated with deciding to have this kind of commitment?
So here's where we get to the point where do you keep talking from the voices of the women you interviewed, or do you talk as the scholar who did the analysis?
How about both?
So in talking with the women, there's only one couple in the book that ended up in divorce while I was talking with them, and following up, only two.
Okay.
So in the time span that I've worked with these families, only two have ended in divorce. The women are very committed to making sure their marriages are sustainable.
And look respectable to the outside, right?
Yeah.
That becomes part of it also.
And that part of it is really important because, you know, when I first started working with them, I thought they were just being very individualistic and not having a communal understanding of, you know, the history and the patterns of Black families. The reason why you're raised to be independent and ambitious is because you're doing something for the community, right? Like you're on a path that's going to, I mean, one woman talked about it, she's a doctor, she talked about how she's asked to make a contribution to society for the community. She's asked to be a mentor and someone that young Black girls can look up to, right? So there's that part of it that says you have a responsibility. So if you pull back from work, you're not doing that part for the community. But the way that these women talked about it was that having these intact families is important work for the community, because family life is devalued, marriage is devalued. We don't have, you know, majority of our children are being raised in single parent households. So they felt like they were still doing that communal part. Right.
By staying
together.
Keeping the marriage together. Right.
Now.
That's interesting.
Analysis, scholar. Yes, this is complicated. I think there are some risks associated with Black women putting more emphasis on their family units than on their careers and on their ambitions.
Right. Or even self-care.
Or even self-care. I think there are some costs associated for them personally, like as individual women. And I talk about this in an article I put out later, the health-related stressors that Black women have. But in addition to that individual perspective, there's also the communal cost, right? Because the internalization of these responses, right? These individual level responses aren't doing anything to change the structures, right? There's no pushback on policies that make it difficult for women to continue to work and take care of their families. There's still the expectation that women are going to take care of their children and their parents and their spouse's parents and auntie and cousin and and the community, right? So
and when you're on the come up in your Black middle class, there's always a cousin Pookie and a cousin Nene that you have to be attentive to also, right?
And
that's
I talk
real.
about that.
Right.
I talk about
real.
that in the book, right? That there were women who were helping people pay bills and, taking people in for a couple of weeks because they didn't have any place to stay. So yeah, all of that, but it's an internal thing. Now, it's a thing that the Black community has always had, right? This individual or at least communal way of taking care of Black people's problems, right? But at this point, I think that we're in a position to be able to push back on a lot of the structures that have made it difficult for all people to navigate all the caregiving that has to happen, right? And that's about the neoliberal moment that we're in right now. It was okay for me to say that, it's everybody is feeling like government supports are being pulled out from under them. So when you talk about Black people who really haven't had a lot of government supports in the first place, having to relinquish the few government supports that are in place, and we're accepting that by turning inward and providing the caregiving that needs to be taking place
rather than the state, right?
It's, I think it puts us in a difficult place, right, in relation to the state.
These are Black women that have gone to undergraduate colleges, universities, professional schools, graduate schools in the last 30 years or so. At some point, they must have sat in somebody's gender and sexuality class. Where does the F word,
Oh my goodness.
where does feminism fit in the lives of these women and the choices that they make?
So here's another one of those splits between the scholar and the respondents. The women in the study did not identify as feminists. Did not. I had one woman who said she was feminist. I had one woman who said she was a womanist. Everybody else was like, I don't trust it.
That's some white woman.
I don't like it.
Right.
They had a visceral response also, though, to being stay-at-home moms. The ones who would be considered stay-at-home moms were like, I'm not a stay-at-home mom.
Right.
They sit around eating bonbons all day.
I'm taking a break.
I have stuff to do.
Right.
I'm running. There was one woman who said, I'm COO.
Right.
of
I got my sorority. I got to take care. Right.
So, they did not identify as feminists. Scholarly perspective on that, Black women are going to have a problem with feminism every day, and I think it's a problem. I identify as a Black feminist at this point, but I didn't as a younger person, and I went to Spelman.
Right. Right. You had Beverly Gottschalk.
Hey, Beverly Gottschalk, and she know we talked. She knows I had to, come around. I had Jonetta Cole. They know I struggled, but I came over to the other side. It's really hard to get African American women to see the benefits of, claiming Black feminism. And what's interesting about that is they're daily practicing it, right? Like it's just like, you're just not naming it. You believe in the principles, you just don't want to identify. And I think that's something that Black feminist theory, intersectional theory, we all need to do a better job of helping everyday Black women understand what it is and how it can be used to aid us in our liberation.
So given everything that's happening on college campuses the last 3 or 4 years, you moved your husband, your daughter, your twin sons, and a couple of cats into Pierson College. What has that been like?
Okay, so this is probably going to be my next study because we're actually commuting.
Oh, wow. Wow.
My husband and my kids are still in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Yep, and I am in New Haven. So they come down when they can. I go up when I can. I'm calling us a commuter family.
Yeah.
I have, because of this arrangement, I have met many other commuter families. When you start talking about your arrangement, right? So people say, how's your family doing in Pierson? And I'm like, oh, they're actually not here. And then I get, My family and I commute too. I have heard so many stories of people who are
least you
doing
got
this.
Amtrak.
But we're actually close. We're an hour and a half.
Yeah.
I have met people who are flying to various destinations to be with their families. And what the struggle for me was, I understood it for men, right? We've always had this model where men go off and work and come back.
Right.
It was harder for me as a woman to do that. I felt like I left my kids.
Right.
I left my husband.
Right.
I'm down here doing this thing by myself.
Yeah.
I have an apartment by myself. That's weird. So for me, it's been, really navigating that feeling of I'm not supposed to be doing this. Right. So I've met other women who are doing a similar type of dance and feeling similarly. It's an expectation. We understand it when men do it, but when women do it and they leave their kids with their husbands, that's different.
Yeah.
That's different.
You've been watching Left of Black. We've been joined by Dr. Riché Barnes, who is the Dean of Pierson College at Yale University. She's also a professor of anthropology. She is the author of the award-winning Raising the Race, Black Career Women Redefine Marriage, Motherhood, and Community, published by Rutgers University Press. The winner of the 2017 Race, Gender, and Class Selection Book Award from the American Sociological Association. Thank you for joining us,
Thank
Dr.
you
Barnes.
so much.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything.